This is the
Five Stars
podcast.
Let me talk to you.
Hi.
So, what do you guys want to talk about? Tell me we're not telling lies.
Thanks, guys. Back to you.
Well, the good news is I got my normal voice back. Kinda. Although I still kind of dig my deeper, groggier sounding voice. Makes me sound more manly. More manly. Manlier. It makes me sound more masculine. Although I heard that's toxic. Right, I forgot. Silly me. I should be drinking estrogen-filled tap water so all the pesticides completely eat away at my T levels. I knew I was doing something wrong. The funny thing is, people think you're crazy when you mention all the horrible crap that's inside most city tap water. But then everybody believes that they're the exception to the rule. Like, oh no, Cleveland tap water is fine. I drink it all the time. Yeah, and there's a reason you sound like somebody's got your testes in an iron vice grip. I'm not saying that if you drink tap water, you're a dope. I'm merely suggesting there are better long-term alternatives. Such as spring water, for example. Or, God forbid, buy yourself a Brita filter so you can remove all the pesticides in your tap water. There are many things you can do to live a healthier, more sustainable life. Don't get married. That's another one. The best thing for my long-term health would be to avoid any and all contact with any information regarding WrestleMania 42. The only positive thing I've heard about that show thus far is the CM Punk Roman Reigns match from night 2. The one that apparently saved that whole event. And I'm talking both nights. I might watch the Punk Reigns match if I have some free time down the road. I mean, you all know, if you ever went back and listened to those old WWE or AEW recaps, I was typically very pro-Punk and pro-Roman. Even when I got a little burnt out on all the Bloodline stuff a few years ago. But people were raving about how good that match was. Including Dave Meltzer of all people. And we all know how anti-Punk the Wrestling Observer has been for the better half of the last 5 years. You need any references, listen to their entire coverage of Punk in AEW. But that's a topical discussion for something later down the road. Today we're here to strictly talk about Midsouth Wrestling. This was one of those retro weeks where they did not air an episode of WCW Saturday Night. I think after last week's 3-hour slog, they went ahead and spared the people the following week. Regardless of the reason they didn't have an episode this week, it'll keep the podcast a little shorter, which is good for both editing and time purposes. That'll give me all of Tuesday evening to do some other things I need to attend to. I've been trying to get back into the habit of writing music more frequently, which is something I really did away with after my college years. I think it was a passion thing for one, but it was also just lack of time and lack of resources. I keep myself busy where I can. And sometimes the best thing for me is to lock myself in a room, sit down at a piano for a few hours with some sheet music, and see what my brain power can come up with. A lot of it's just a general blueprint of ideas. How that'll translate to actual music? Well, that's the fun part. I gotta figure that out. I should start using some of my compositions as outros for these shows. I always use that canned stuff from iMovie to avoid copyright claims. But if it's my personal stuff, I'm not gonna get flagged. At least I would hope. I might actually start doing that. I'll see what I can dig up. I wouldn't use a full composition. Maybe like a 60-second snippet of something I've been working on. But that'll be an editing procedure. Right now we got some more classic wrestling to dive into. So let's do. Back at it again with Midsouth Wrestling. And a lot of this week was an expansion on stuff we had covered the other week. There have been, well, two primary stories going on. There's the TV title tournament, which they're knee-deep in by this point. Then there's the General Akbar Kamala material, where they've been actively putting out a hit list on a handful of the top babyfaces. Mainly Terry Taylor, Hacksaw Duggan, and I think Brickhouse Brown was the other name. And so they showed a clip from the Municipal Auditorium. It was billed as a Ugandan street fight. An anything goes, no disqualification match where, well, to be flat out honest with you, I'm still not entirely sure what the rules were for this match. It kind of seemed like they were implying that the only way to win was by leaving ringside. But as we came to learn, leaving ringside didn't mean jack shit. Instead, what we got was Taylor getting clocked with Akbar's walking cane following the ref bump with Carl Fergie. Then as Kamala tried to go up top to give him the big splash, Taylor's insurance policy capitalized in the form of Hacksaw Duggan. So he came down and whacked Kamala with a 2x4, which subsequently led to Duggan running the heels off. And then Taylor was awarded the belt back via no contest. To my knowledge, it did not seem like this had any conclusive finish. The heels bailed, and Fergie just gave Taylor his belt back. It was a very strange stipulation match. Not exactly sure what they were going for with the whole Ugandan roll street fight. Also, nitpicky thing. Why did they need a ref bump if it was no DQ, anything goes? That's one of those logic gaffes in wrestling that we're all supposed to overlook. And so that led to Akbar's pre-taped interview with JR, where he vowed that Duggan would pay for costing Kamala the North American title. Oh yeah, by the way, forgot to mention that Ugandan death match, street fight, whatever it was a title match. So Akbar made a promise that Duggan would have a receipt coming, which is kind of on par with what he threatened to do a couple weeks ago. But I guess he's serious now. Even though all we've seen him and Kamala do is run from Duggan like scalded dogs for the last 3 weeks. So from there, we get the next round in our television title tournament. It's Tom Pritchard versus Hacksaw Duggan. And as much as I'm a big fan of Dr. Tom, looking at something like this on paper, especially for where both guys were slated at this point in their careers, it was a total mismatch on paper. It was a foregone conclusion as to who was going over. I think the question was more so a matter of, were they actually going to let Dr. Tom get in some offense on Duggan here? Or was it going to be a straight ahead glorified squash? Well, we got our answer. It was kind of neither. Instead, what we got was Pritchard realizing that he was totally swimming up shit's creek without a paddle, knowing that he was way in over his head to think he could compete on the same level as Hacksaw Duggan. So he ended up taking an intentional countout loss in order to save his own skin. He decided the title and the money was not worth getting his ass handed to him. And so Duggan advances. They also had Dirty Dutch scouting on the floor for some peculiar reason. He was actually out there for several segments this week, just watching guys at ringside. Never got involved, though. So we'll see how that factors into everything in the coming weeks. Kind of a bizarre match, but like again, did anybody actually think Pritchard stood a chance of winning this match? They already kind of established that he only advanced in the tournament because he outsmarted Tim Horner. Not that that was a difficult task to begin with. So this was about what I expected it to be. I know it probably didn't paint Tom in the best light. Bear in mind that he's a heel, and with him trying to get over this more brash, cocky heel persona on TV, it's not unlikely that a guy like Tom Pritchard would back down from somebody the caliber of Jim Duggan. You know, it's not like he was backing down from a Mike Jackson or something. So I was okay with this. He even addressed in his promo after the break, where he talked about he was looking to use his brain power as opposed to his pure athletic skill all the time. He's going to pick and choose his spots in Midsouth. You know, that means having to sacrifice 10 grand in the TV title to save himself a major beating from a dangerous animal like Jim Duggan. So be it. I mean, would you fault him? He's got a valid point. And so that took us to one of the most remarkably and laughably bad TV matches I've seen in quite a while. And when I introduce the parties here, you'll see why that was the case. The match is Kamala versus Thor. And I truthfully don't know what the deal was here. But if you were to tell me that Thor was deliberately selling like shit in order to send a message to Watts, I would not have doubted you. We know what we're getting when it comes to Kamala's matches. They are far from visual masterpieces. But given that his opponent was a guy that had a reputation for wrestling with 2 left feet, you can see why this ended up being a laughably terrible sight. Between the usual wacky Kamala offense and Thor bumping for everything like he was overselling for a backyard outlaw promotion, every single time Thor took a bump in this match, I howled. My favorite spot, though, was when Kamala legitimately tripped trying to pick Thor up and get him to his feet. It was like second to last spot before the finish, but it was such a fitting moment. But like I said, I have no idea what the hell Thor was doing here. There's a part of me that wants to believe he was selling like crap on purpose. But maybe he legitimately was that bad. Maybe I've underestimated just how truly awful the future Nails was as a worker. Because I know he sucked in the WWF. The match only went about 2 minutes. But you can bet your life that I 100% went back and rewatched that whole thing a second time. And it was totally worth it. This is one of those matches that you show to people out of irony. When people ask, what's the best possible way to expose the business and make it look phony as fuck? You know, without showing dumb shit like guys setting each other on fire or going through furniture. This is probably the best example of a basic professional wrestling match that exposes just how silly the sport can be at times. I'm not advocating you watch it for rage bait purposes. I'm just implying that if you need a good laugh, Kamala versus Thor on Midsouth television in 1985, totally worth the watch. And of course, no sooner should I make a reference to the idea of exposing the business and making wrestling look fake, do we pitch to Boyd and the Cowboy, where Watts starts to go into one of his soapbox diatribes about all the shit happening in the Northeast with Vince McMahon making wrestling look fake as possible, with all the dog and pony show celebrities and Tuesday Night Titans BS, the Rock and Roll Connection, talking about how when people ask if wrestling is real or fake, they ought to be looking at situations like with what happened to Hacksaw Butch Reed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, after he got done with a grueling match and the entire left side of his face was practically swelled up. By the way, sidebar, it was funny how they never mentioned who Hacksaw wrestled or what led to his face getting caved in. But the important thing that he wanted to stress was that for any of the doubters who think wrestling's a bunch of bogus sports entertainment garbage, well, they should get in the ring so Butch can cure their skepticism. You know, it's... whatever. I was going to say something about the whole concept of these Bill Watts tangents. See, the thing is, he's not wrong. Yes, we all know wrestling is a work. It's not like people hadn't already started catching on to this kind of stuff by this point, even though they were still trying to maintain some form of kayfabe. It's just the idea that Watts is spending like 3 minutes of TV time ranting about the shit Vince is doing up north, instead of just focusing on the Mid-South product and what made that product unique. When you think about what ultimately led to Watts' downfall in the wrestling business, was it pettiness? Was it arrogance? Was it him just never being able to get out of his own way? Many things can be true at once. But it's like the JYD situation, where we had to hear the cowboy bury the dog on TV for weeks following his departure from Midsouth last year, instead of just letting it go and moving on from it. He had to keep digging. He had to keep driving that wedge further. It's like, dude, can you just shut the fuck up and worry about the here and now? Complaining that the dog left you high and dry and betrayed all the fans was not going to do anything to grow your business. It's the same principle with him always having to constantly talk about what Vince was doing. I mean, in a way, it's the same issue that TNA had for years when they were always referencing the WWF on their shows. I always coined it the TNA inferiority complex syndrome. This is the same kind of thing. Like, Watts always having to try to bury Vince any chance he got. As if any of it was actually going to do anything to make his product better, or sell tickets, or do anything to financially grow. Like, even if I agree with a lot of what Watts is saying, it's a case of learning how to stay in your own lane. Stop projecting. Don't worry about what Vince is doing. Focus on your shit. Focus on trying to keep your product fresh. The territories were already starting to die away by this point. God forbid Watts could have kept his head above water longer if he stayed the course and not get swept up in those other guys and what those other guys are doing. Anyway, soapbox rant done. Let's talk about Jake Roberts and the Barbarian versus Richard Dye and Paul Brown, which I wrote very little down about to begin with. But I did capture this little audio sample that I wanted to bring to you for amusement. It certainly caught me off guard when I first heard it.
Other 2 feet. Sure, these guys know how to fall, but knowing how to fall doesn't help you when you come down from 7 feet in the air. You still get up with pain in your kidneys. There's sometimes blood in your urine, prostrate trouble. It's a tough, rugged sport, and these are great athletes.
Yeah, that was a bit of a head scratcher, wasn't it? That also sounds highly unpleasant. I'm thinking if you wake up with blood samples in your urine, you might have some other outstanding health issues you need to address. Aside from taking a bad bump on a wrestling mat one night. Like, ever so often I listen to these Watts clips and think, was he on drugs? Or was he literally just batshit insane? What the fuck was he even trying to get at? That's what I want to know. So the Barbarian put Dye away with a full Nelson. Then to put the icing on the cake, Jake came in and DDT'd Paul Brown. He also did a wacky springing leap to his feet, which was something I never expected to see out of Jake the Snake. Kind of in the same way I never expected to hear Bill Watts talk about bloody piss and urinary tract infections. Or whatever the fuck he was trying to get at in that conversation. So So then we came back to relive a clip from October of 1983. A match that featured King Kong Bundy taking on a super green, super young Dr. Death Steve Williams. Yeah, you want to talk about going back in the time machine. When Midsouth was much grainier. There is definitely a bit of nostalgia going back and seeing a lot of those older shows before they upgraded their camera equipment. The crazy thing about it, though, is I haven't thought about that match since we reviewed it a couple years ago. But as soon as they rolled the clip and I saw Bundy in there with Dr. Death, I immediately remember what the finish was. It's amazing how you can recall simple stuff like that just by getting those quick visual references, even after having not thought about something for months. That was the match where Dr. Death hit Bundy with the Oklahoma Stampede and scored the big upset win. If I recall, I think that was the first time Bundy got pinned on Mid-South TV, right? Or at least one of the first times. I think Bundy had already technically been beaten by countout before, but I don't think anybody actually pinned his shoulders down prior to Dr. Death. So that was a huge career milestone for him. That was also back when Steve was in much worse ring shape than he is now. I mean, he had only made the transition to wrestling full-time a few months prior, so he was still trying to really figure things out, so to speak. I think the clip was more designed to give Watts fuel to talk about how real wrestling is. As if he hadn't already beaten that talking point to death. So that took us to Brickhouse Brown versus The Wrestler, with Dirty Dutch back out at ringside scouting. And oddly enough, he was out there scouting several matches, but they all involved men that Akbar had been threatening to sick Kamala on. We had Duggan, we had Terry Taylor later on, now Brickhouse. Coincidence? Or maybe story related? The match is highly unremarkable. Brickhouse won with a leaping clothesline, Delia Bob. Kind of seemed like he and the mask guy were having some major miscommunication issues at the end. A lot of weird no-selling and potatoing going on. Not sure what that was about. Maybe this masked wrestler wanted to try to get his shit in, but Brickhouse wasn't having it. But yeah, nothing else to add. There were mild, boring chants from the crowd. Honestly, not all that surprising to hear, given the lack of fan interest for Brickhouse at this point. We had the Nightmare taking on Private Terry Daniels. Now, we talked about him and Eddie Gilbert making their Mid-South debuts the other week. And I spent a good deal talking about Eddie's Mid-South run over the next couple years. I did not really spend a whole great deal of time talking about the Nightmare. Now, the guy under the mask was Moondog Rex, in case you were curious. I had first seen footage of him when he was wrestling in Memphis with Moondog King, when they were both a part of the First Family with Jimmy Hart. They had a pretty well-known feud with the Fabulous Ones that I remember drew a lot of business in like '83. But that was where I had first seen them. They've also had various WWF runs throughout their career, going back to the early '80s. That's in addition to all the other places Rex worked throughout his career. He was another one of those guys that bounced around to a lot of different territories. Didn't really have a stable home that he worked with. But he was a very big name throughout the 80s. I remember seeing tapes of him working with Hogan right as Vince was overtaking with the national expansion in 84. Like, for all the people that like to give Hogan shit for being a horrible worker, those matches with Moondog Rex were not bad. If you can find the tapes out there somewhere, I think they were title matches. Unfortunately, I don't have many thoughts about his run in Mid-South. I know he and Eddie worked together through most of the year before Moondog splits and Eddie goes on to do his own thing later on. But they kind of build them as one of those bodyguard, chicken shit, loudmouth heel type pairings where Eddie would get to do the promos and hide behind Moondog while he did all the dirty work. It was actually a good pairing in hindsight, but I don't think it lasted all that long. The main takeaway here was Eddie doing commentary and putting over the Nightmares gimmick. I appreciated him referring to Terry Daniels as a poor man's Gomer Pyle. That was good. Obviously, Eddie would gain a lot more confidence over time on the mic. Here, he was a bit reserved. He was still a good, effective heel, but you could tell he wasn't trying to be too over the top. But it accomplished what it set out to do. Eddie made some good impressions on the mic. The Nightmare got himself over as a big powerhouse athlete. I like that Eddie wasted no time calling out all the top babyfaces in Mid-South. There's good stuff here. And like I noted the other week, really looking forward to getting to dive into all the Hot Stuff Inc. material. You know, with all the Eddie Gilbert stuff we've reviewed in the last few years, I don't think any of it compares to the 86-87 UWF run he had. Not even close. Up next, we had Bill Dundee taking on Jack Victory. Pretty simple enhancement squash for Dundee. There was one particular spot that I wanted to call attention to. A very impressive spot that I don't think I've ever seen anybody do prior, including in all Bill Dundee matches I've seen over the years. A frontward monkey flip out of the corner, wherein after being shot into the ropes, he leapt into the air over Victory, took a flat back bump, only to immediately extend his legs in the air, and then as soon as Victory turned around, Dundee shot him halfway across the ring. And the best part, it didn't look phony at all. Smooth as silk. You know, part of the drawing appeal when it came to a guy like Superstar Dundee was the emphasis on him being a smaller guy. But you could still take him seriously as an athlete. He was small, but he still had a frame. It's not like what you see today with a lot of guys where wrestlers are both short and lack any sense of muscle tone. I know that probably won't sit well with a lot of people, but truth hurts, man. Put Bill Dundee in the ring with any top guy today. I'd buy him being able to have a credible match before I buy seeing half the AEW roster. And at least with Dundee, he probably still knows a few basics at this point. Even at the ripe age of 81, or however old he is now. Man, he's another one of those childhood favorites of mine. And when his time comes, that's going to be tough. I've already lost 2/3 of my Midnight Express. But guys like Dundee and Lawler and some of those old school big names, they're not going to be around for much longer either. Father Time always catches up at some point. Don't take them for granted while they're still around. Handsome Jimmy's another one. And so that left us with Terry Taylor versus Edgar Boo Thomas. This was probably one of those best case scenario matches where it was about as good as you can make Taylor versus Edgar Boo Thomas without it completely falling apart. Knowing that Thomas was, for lack of better terms, lacking in ring skill. But I thought Taylor carried him well. Watts talked about all the big things on Taylor's radar in 1985, including him gunning for the NWA World Heavyweight title with Ric Flair. Kind of brings me back to those conversations we had when Taylor had a lot going for him as a star in the mid-'80s. Then once Vince got a hold of him and gave him the worst gimmick of all time, completely ruined Taylor's career as we knew it. But I think a lot of people forget that Taylor was a pretty big deal in like 84 or 85. Not to mention the popularity he had already gained in places like Memphis and Florida a few years prior. I was kind of chalked it up to, once he left the UWF, it was all downhill. Remember, he had that brief piss break stop in Crockett Promotions in late 87 that went virtually nowhere. And then by 88, he was in the WWF with a fucking rooster mohawk. Yeah, if you're on the hunt for Terry Taylor highlight clips, I would highly encourage avoid watching anything after the year 1987. It is not worth the disappointment. But anyway, he went over with the figure 4 here. Credit to Thomas, though. He sold the hell out of that figure 4 hold. Did a great job getting over the idea that Taylor was about to snap his leg in half. I mean, he sold that hold better than most guys ever sell the figure 4 leg lock today. You can kind of tell they're in a holding pattern with Taylor as the North American champion, as they're trying to develop more top heels to go after him. And they seem to be putting the finishing touches on the beef with him and Kamala. So we will see what they've got planned as they start heading into the summertime. But there you go. It's kind of another one of those shows where not a whole lot of great substance happened, but it was still an enjoyable 45-minute program. And for my sanity, I'm glad that I could get this one done in, well, under an hour at least. But there you go. I want to take the last couple minutes here to just thank everybody that comes back to check out the show every week. I don't think I did any plugs in the intro, so I'll go ahead and get them out of the way now. Make sure you subscribe, comment, and leave the show a like. You can come check us out on YouTube and Rumble on Mondays and Fridays for new shows. And we will reconvene this coming Monday for our continuation of the Retro Raw coverage. And I think that's all I got for now. I'm still a little under the weather. I gained my voice back to some extent, but still a little nasally and not 100%. But I'm getting there. So hopefully by Monday I'll be fully recovered. But I'll talk to you all then. Take care all. Peace out.